Clashes erupted in Bangkok as police tried to stop pro-democracy protesters from marching towards the royal palace. The police fired water cannon on demonstrators who were trying to march to the royal palace to deliver letters demanding reforms related to the powerful monarchy. Protesters have been demanding curbs on King Maha Vajiralongkorn's powers and the removal of pro-royalty government. And these are the visuals we get you from Bangkok. As you can see, around 10,000 protesters took to the streets of Bangkok as they continued to demand reforms to the government in Thailand. They are demanding a curb of King Maha Vajiralongkorn's powers and the removal of Prime Minister of the country.
We are the people who want to change, and we are the people who living with the time. And the time passed by, you cannot just live as what you already live for a long time. I want him to change the way we want to, because we are the owner of this country. Yeah.
Earlier, over 1,000 protesters descended on Bangkok's Democracy Monument, demanding dialogue with the king and a joint solution to the national crisis. Remember that speaking against the monarchy is taboo in Thailand, and there are strict and, might I say, draconian laws that prohibit Thais from speaking to or questioning the majesties. Violators of the Royal Defamation Act could face up to 15 years in jail. The Royal Palace has so far not commented on the protests since the start, which was in July. However, last week, King Maha Vajiralongkorn said that Thailand is a land of compromise, where all protesters are still loved and all public gatherings remain banned within 150 meters of royal buildings. The protests in Thailand are polarized. While one side is demanding reforms in the monarchy, there is a strong pro-monarchy faction that has been countering the protests by chanting royalist slogans on Thailand's streets. They say that the monarchy is the identity of Thailand and needs to be protected at all costs. The protesters, on the other hand, say that they seek to put the king more clearly under constitution, which means a reversal of recent amendments that gave the king more control of the palace, fortune and a few army units as well. The anti-government protesters claim that it is the monarchy which has helped enable decades of military domination in Thailand. Joining us on this broadcast now is Phil Robertson, Deputy Director, Asia Division in Human Rights Watch, and he's joining us from Bangkok. Phil, thank you so much for joining us on WION, giving us your time. Now, these are some of the largest protests that Thailand has seen for decades. We are learning that this is only the second or the third time in months that the Thailand authorities used water cannons to quell the protests. However, the protesters still managed to reach within meters of the royal palace to put forth their demands once again.
That's correct. We believe that peaceful protests should not be met with water cannons. There was no indication that these protesters were going to commit any sort of violence. They were simply attempting to deliver letters to the palace. And the use of water cannon last night is another example of overreaction by the authorities.
Absolutely. They have been largely peaceful, isn't it, these protests? I went through a few of the letters, and one of them clearly states that it's the duty of the king to listen to not only those who love him and listen to him, but also those who criticize him, because all of the people of Thailand are his subjects. Has the king or the monarchy shown any signs of sitting down on the table and actually listening to what these protesters are demanding?
So far, there's been no reaction whatsoever from the palace. In fact, there has been discussion within the parliament about having a reconciliation committee formed to bring all groups together. That would be government and the parliamentary leaders and the protesters and others. And that should be progressed. That should be moving forward. But so far, the government has been dragging its feet on that. And the palace, again, is not involved in those negotiations, at least openly. What's worrisome now, though, is that we're seeing some of those ultra-loyalist, ultra-royalist yellow shirt groups coming out today calling for their supporters to confront and attack the student protesters. And other royalist groups are calling for the Thai military to conduct a military coup d'etat. So, I mean, I think the government should now recognize that it needs to act to restrain these yellow shirt vigilantes and make sure there's no military coup.
Right. Monarchy is a revered institution in Thailand. Like we've seen thousands of protesters take to the streets. There have been several counter-protests as well by those who are loyalists to the Thai monarchy. But still, if we just focus on these protests, while the authorities may have figured that this is a passing protest, that people will eventually return to their homes, that has not been the case. The protests are ongoing for 2 to 3 months now in Thailand. In fact, what we are learning is that there were close to 10,000 people on the streets, even yesterday, demanding that the authorities listen to their rights. They want the greater control of the constitution over the king. They want the removal of the prime minister. Is there any headway possible in this tussle? Because so far, the monarchy hasn't shown any inclination, like you said, to sit down and talk with the protesters.
I think the one place that there may be possibility for movement would be talking about constitutional reform. And perhaps if that happens, there may also be a way to deal with the issue of the government and the issue of the prime minister. But so far, we've seen no indication from the palace or the government that they're prepared to make any compromises about the existing structure or the regulations and constitutional provisions that deal with the monarchy. That is still off the table as far as the government and the palace are concerned. And so it's hard to see that how there's going to be progress made in that area. I think perhaps it's worthwhile to think about how to make progress in the areas where they can talk, like constitutional reform and respecting human rights. That's also an issue that is one of the demands of the protesters, that there should be an end to harassment and abuse by the government of people demanding their rights, and then open a dialogue. I think, the government could, also stop charging student leaders with sedition and other serious crimes. That it's hard to negotiate with someone when you're busy putting them in prison.
Phil Robertson, thank you so much for joining us. Close to 10,000 protesters once again took to the streets of Bangkok. Despite facing prison term and jail term, they continue to demand their rights and a change in the monarchy and the governance of Thailand.